Welcome to Brain Cage, where we discuss BDSM, hypnosis, and the mind for all those exploring their fetishes and interests.
This is Puppet Master, your mentor for the podcast.
And this is Dracoso, your hypnotic guide.
So today we're going to be talking about transformation play. That is the alteration of what already exists. Most people consider it the alteration of the self, but it can also be other people and things as well. I hope that you learned something, or we give you a few ideas to play with, because it's something that both me and Dracoso enjoy doing with our play partners.
Quite a bit. And it can be very fun, especially when you're diving in and you're trying to create a new idea for who or how a person wants to play or what they want to do. From pet play and helping a person get more into a role, to full-on transformation play where you are making someone become a whole nother being.
And it can be simple or complex. If you've ever done improv or tabletop roleplay, then you know that a character doesn't need a lot for one to come up with ideas and elaborate on it. But it's also important to recognize that it's a skill that one can learn and one can get better at in time. And if something does go wrong during it, it's probably because one person has expected the other person to read their mind and not given a good enough prompt or gift, dependent on the terminology being used. So don't worry about that. It's something to learn, and one gets better at it with practice.
Right, it comes down to being able to engage the person. We've talked about in past podcasts the idea of communicating and understanding what a partner is looking for. When I say partner, a person you're working with, subject, submissive, someone who you are exploring with.
Yeah, there's a reason we did that first.
Right, and so it helps to, especially with a lot of these topics we talk about, and transformation play picks up on it very heavily. It's the idea that if you are going to explore with someone and make them or help them or even transform them from one state into another, especially transformation, you want to understand what aspects of that transformation are the most salient to them. What are the things that they are going to really pick up on the most? And it comes down to the psychological changes, the physical changes, whether or not there is a certain aspect to it they connect with. I mean, a simple idea would be talking about maids. The idea that most people have in some way experienced or seen maids, whether it's in a movie, whether it's talking to someone else, and in general they have similar aspects that people pick up on, such as a uniform, such as what their responsibilities may be and what they do, and this gives a baseline of understanding as to if someone wants to be a maid, does that mean that they expect there to be a uniform? Do they expect to do certain responsibilities? Is it more of a role play scenario where you want them to be a maid that is coming into a certain situation? And so when it comes to transformation play, it's really thinking about how are you altering the person? How are you altering the environment? And then how are you altering their past as well as their present and their future? The idea of, are they going to imagine having just become a maid? Are they coming into a scenario where they have already been a maid for a long time? And are you going to make it so only they are changing? Or are you making it so that the people around them change, that there's a shift? And it's about immersing that mentality. It's about the idea that we discussed before with flow, and just the idea that you want them to become a natural part of it.
One that you missed is actually the idea that they might be becoming one. Because if they don't have experience role-playing this before, then it can be quite a good segue into the role-play to have someone training to be such, or slowly transforming, or whatever the product of this will be.
True.
It's good to consider the subject's familiarity with the subject matter. when doing transformation play.
Right. It's the idea of how well can they imagine being this character or in this situation. And in a lot of ways, we spend time because not a lot of people will sit down and think about what would it be like if I was another person. They may question why would someone do something and then try to put themselves in their shoes. But in a lot of ways, people do spend time. And this is sort of a social awareness that we gain over the years as we grow up, the idea of what we might expect someone else to do or how they might react to our words and what kind of expectations we have and that they have. And so we have a natural sense of learning and understanding that we get into for who it is that we talk with and how they work. Even when you see a maid, people have this idea of what would be expected of a maid and what they would do. Say, another example would be a nurse, which is some people just imagine a nurse being someone who assists you in a medical situation. They're a profession where people are meant to understand anatomy in different parts, versus in more of a kinky sense, the nurse might be seen as someone who is more playful, more teasing, may go into certain fetishes more often than others, such as they may do certain forms of play that might not be as expected in other scenarios. So we do naturally pick up on how would another person act, how would they think, or what would they say. And we pick this up and take it as just knowledge that's a need to know. So delving a bit deeper into that and trying to put yourself in another person's position can help you to understand more fully what it might be like if you were to transform or if someone else was to transform in certain aspects that may make it more immersive.
Absolutely. When considering the transformation, there are different things to consider that will help the subject become more engaged in the suggestion. Psychological changes, physical changes, and noting the modality will help immerse them in it. And immersion is really key. And I think there are a couple of examples of immersion that people will be able to relate to. Gaming, a lot of people have grown up with that now. And when you're really into a game, you're just in the flow of it. And that's a kind of immersion. Or reading a book is another kind of immersion when you're no longer considering the words as much and you're just so into the story. Creating a sense of immersion is an important aspect of transformation play. How would you go about that, Dracoso?
Well, I'm imagining as we're talking, I'm actually thinking about some of the largest franchises that exist, such as the one about the boy wizard, or about the space stories of people fighting up with plasma beam swords. And you can tell very hard I'm trying not to say large franchise names.
Yeah, Bible Man.
But, the Bible Man, yes.
They had lightsabers in that.
Oh, they did? Oh, okay.
It's has a lot of terrible aspects, a lot of homophobia, transphobia and stuff, because it's Bible Man. It wasn't good when it came out and it hasn't aged well.
Right. No worries, but I think the main point that I can imagine here, especially if you're trying to think of how do I mentally wrap myself around this idea of immersion, there's so many large franchises out there that have done movies, books, stories. When you're reading a book, when you're watching a movie, it's very easy to imagine yourself as a watcher, a person that is somehow trailing this story, popping from one place to another, and that this visual is just another role that you are playing where you are sort of this watcher in many situations. Many people who watch these large franchises and become very immersed in them go out and dress up. I mean, there's cosplaying where people actually will become those roles, and they will physically dress up to become closer to that character and even walk around and act more like that individual or that being. Or, heck, I mean, even if you're going to be a large collective, it's about getting into the mindset for it, and that would be more of, for something that is a fan-specific piece. For other people, reading a good story, reading a good book, you can imagine yourself as a watcher in the story, you can imagine yourself as the main character, or even putting yourself in a role where you are going to interact with the characters and become a part of that story in your own. Some people write fan fiction to try and create their own story as if they were going to immerse themselves and be an influencer over the world. And so for the more general public, I say a good sense of immersion would be watching a movie that you enjoy very personally. It's one that you can connect with and you feel like you understand it well enough, you know the pieces, and watching it, it becomes almost as though you're a part of that story. You let yourself tune out the sensations, the things that are going on that take you out of the movie, and you let yourself become a part of it. On top of that, video games are a great example because so many people do play them. But even for people who don't play video games, if not movies, books, and video games, a simple thing would be imagining the immersion of your work. Have you ever had a day where you were at work, and hopefully there have been some of these days, where you've just lost track of time and you've gotten into the role and you were playing as moving the pieces, projects, different papers, different things you might have been working on, the people you interacted with, the meetings you might have run, and just imagine you've become so immersed in it that you become the role. The steps are there. The points of what you have to do or say or interact with are there, and they're natural. They're almost automatic. And that is a sense of immersion where you are stepping into a role. Transformation play is when you have those external pieces acting and building into that reshaping of a perception to where you can become this role so fully that you can engage it, and depending on how much a person wants to be engaged within it, everything from simply feeling that you're in the role as naturally as you might at work or at a movie, to becoming and believing that you are that person or being, and allowing the past to weave into it where you believe that this is how it has been enough that it becomes natural, where your mind can accept it, that you can actually transition into this feeling. Kind of like if you've ever been in a job for long enough and you realize that eventually it's just become natural. Being able to build that out and transform someone into that role can be, in that sense, a natural transition into becoming just how they are.
You can do that over a long period of time. When you get to a new job, you can often feel out of place, and then you ease into the role, and then you've become that thing in that moment. And I think it's good to also look at what allows people to immerse themselves more easily in fiction. And if you've looked at this, it's often the case that you'll have a blank protagonist that people can project themselves onto, will help people immerse themselves in it more. In Guardians of the Galaxy, it's the token human. In Skyrim, you've literally got no character to your character. It's all whatever you want to portray, and a lot of people play the good guy when given an option in RPGs, because no one wants to see themselves as a bad person, and thus they tend towards the good types of character. It's why people cheer on the good person in the movies. So having a blank character, allowing the subject to put more of themselves into the character, will more easily allow them to be immersed. But over a longer period of time, you can build up a certain character to be quite different. And you can experiment with your subject. You can see how skilled they are at doing this and dial it down to where they are very comfortable. And then you can build up on this over a longer period of time to create more engaging and interesting and different characters for them to be. And that can be a fun project, I think. I've done it myself. Dracoso, have you ever built something up like that over a longer period of time?
Well, I don't know if it would be considered a long period of time, but I did have one person, and it was a couple. This one woman wanted to actually be able to live her life as a mannequin. This may sound a little bit obscure or strange to some people who are listening, but the idea was that she felt very comfortable with her body. She wanted to express it in a way where she could be dressed up, she could be put up. And in many ways, most people, when they're told you are just an object, you are just to be looked at, it's very offensive, it's very upsetting. To this person, it was actually empowering. It gave them this personal view.
A good example
Hmm?
that people more easily understand is objectification, and
Hmm.
the idea that being viewed in a certain way can be positive if you're admired. It can be part of degradation as well.
Right. I mean, it comes into the idea of what their mentality or what they believe is empowering or something that they feel will give more meaning. Some people in their lives, I've talked with several individuals who enjoy being submissive, and they've told me that the reasons are because they want less to have to do. Sometimes in their normal daily lives, they have to be in charge of everything. They have to be in control. They have to decide what happens. And it can be very stressful. It can be very anxiety inducing. And being in a state where they have less to decide, things are chosen for them, and they can feel safe and secure can not only be very relieving, but can be very, well, arousing in many ways, because it means that they're aligning with their own personal desires very deeply. And so this woman that I was working with was very interested in having that sense of control to decide this is what she wants to do by giving up control specifically to her, as I said, it was a couple, to her boyfriend, very long-term boyfriend, and they were very curious to see if it's possible to have her turned into this mannequin, this being that she actually ended up doing modeling, so it aligned with her career. And the way they set it up was very simply, they would have a glass box, raised glass box that was about a foot off the ground with a little walk-up point to get into it. And she would stand and there would be supports that would hold her by her, I believe it was around the waist, by the elbows, and then by the legs. So it'd be almost like she was standing in this holding case where her body could go stiff and rigid and still be comfortable. And so it took about 2 weeks of building because I would do sessions and build up the idea and start with what it felt like to get into that position. And like we were saying, it becomes more of a build up, a growth over time because you start with certain aspects. If you try to jump in and simply say you will go stiff and rigid, it may not give them the depth of what does it mean? What does the transition between being as they are normally into the state of being stiff and rigid? They may not have the same idea. Well, one, they may not share the same idea that you have about certain concepts, and asking questions at length may be troublesome. It may seem an issue, but it's better to know this before you get into the scene. But it's also good to ask specific questions. For this, I simply asked her what it meant to be positioned like a mannequin. And she simply described to me mannequins she'd seen at the mall, things that she'd seen in the past and thought that would be amazing to be in that position. And I discussed with her the difference of the weight of her body, the positioning that she would be standing in, and how she would get there. Would she put herself? Would someone else put her there? And we talked little by little about the different aspects of it, and it built out this idea in her mind. And I believe one topic we might have talked a little bit about before was priming. Talking and discussing how it's going to happen puts down the groundwork, the foundational work for their mind to pick up aspects as you talk about it. So there's an agreed upon outline that you can work with. So with this person, and I know I'm going very into detail and very into depth with it, but hopefully it's giving a little bit more understanding with it. As we built this in and we put in the physical representation of this large plexiglass box that she would stand in, her boyfriend over time would talk with her outside of our sessions and build this out and discuss with her why she was doing it, what she wanted to do, and had done this both before and during our outline and discussing what was working, what wasn't. And it created this sort of 3-person process where we were able to build. He was able to take information and translate it in a different format. And that's why it was only about a 2-week process, because he already knew her very intimately, and I was able to come in and work with both of them to help her get to this point. And the immersion was really, during the day, she could go walk up into this box with his help closing the door behind her as she would get into position, and then if he even wanted to enhance it, he could move her in subtle ways that would make her feel more like someone was positioning her, like a mannequin. So all different aspects of the physical, what is it going to feel like internally to them, to what does the outer world look like to them to reflect that. The psychological of, does it have to be in a certain format for you to make it work? Does it need to be in a certain way? And the 1 foot raised off the ground was a very big psychological factor. It was physical because she was raised. It was very psychological because of the fact that if she just stood in the middle of a room and was relaxed against these posts, or these, I guess you could say holders, they would hold different parts of her body, she would not feel as immersed because it would feel like she was just standing there. Like she was a part of the rest of the room. And so she felt more like a person sitting there. By raising her a foot off the ground, the mentality was now so much more, it was so different. She felt like she was no longer a part of the room, but rather she was raised to a position where she was now on display for the rest of the room. And so each piece that comes down to this situation really builds out, what does the person see, how do they feel, and even throughout the process. And just building off on Puppet's comment earlier that if it doesn't work, if there is a failure with it, that's fine. The big thing a lot of people don't pick up, especially during things like transformation play or pet play, is if something goes wrong, if they feel like there was something that happened, like they didn't like a certain aspect, imagine flipping it and asking them otherwise. I had one person who I did transformation play with who absolutely hated the backs of her thighs being touched. It's very, very specific. If the backs of her thighs were touched while she was playing as the animal she was transformed into, she would not be able to continue the scene. So what we did instead was, I went the opposite direction. I made it so that she had no feeling in the back of her thighs. I made the fur so thick on the back of her thighs that if someone touched it, she wouldn't feel anything. It would feel the same way as if a breeze went across it. And this helped her get more immersed. Because now, that part of her, because if anything would touch it, it would throw her off. But our brain is constantly monitoring certain things. So going the exact opposite direction, possibly removing that sensation in a way that would seem natural, can actually create more immersion. Simply by focusing on the good and possibly helping to reverse or redirect the negative. It creates this sensation, like with the person who's a mannequin. If she felt like she was a part of the room and that was a drawback, make it so that she is no longer a part of the room, but instead that it is a focus that is outside of the room, in a sense. Have you have any experiences with this puppet?
Less long term, but people like being cute cats or puppies, kittens, and the way I've built it up with them is I've introduced things like have them chase an imaginary laser pointer around, and then it's even better in some ways that it's imaginary because they can imagine they've caught it without needing cat-like skills. But if you did use a prop, then they wouldn't need to imagine it, and their mind would be more open to other things. There's positives and negatives to it. One of mine has, which I gave them for my own amusement, a guinea pig trigger. And I get them to nom carrots and stuff, and they go, it is so cute. I mean, guinea pig noises. You get very embarrassed, but that's part of it for them. And making sure you're treating them like they expect to be treated is a big part. Like you said, with moving the mannequin, it can help a lot if efforts are being made on both sides to properly roleplay it, rather than just get the person on stage and treat them like a chicken, that trope that comes up so often when people talk about hypnosis. If you handed them some corn to eat, it'd give them something to do and focus on, and that would actually immerse it more. But most hypnotists don't do that so much unless it's at a party or a stage show, because it pleases the crowd to see something that they're more familiar with. Adding things on the other side of the role play is very good, very important, I think, for getting that sense of immersion.
Right. It's about the person who is doing the hypnosis becoming a part of the scene as well.
Yeah.
Some people who explore hypnosis do it almost like a puppeteering, where they're trying to stay out of the scene and they're trying to play the different pieces and the roles. And with transformation play, unless specifically the person is saying that you should or should not be involved in the role, and you should sit down and have a discussion and say, like with the situation with the couple, having the boyfriend play the part of the mannequin maintenance person, or whatever role that you would imagine it being for moving the mannequin around.
The MMP, yes.
Yeah. Yes, the MMP. Anyways, it's important to understand that the more immersed that the person who is doing the hypnosis or the play, this is both for BDSM and for hypnosis, the more immersed the person who is leading it, the more the person who's being led can become immersed in it, as long as it's in the same direction as what's expected. So, if you have someone that you're turning into a maid, for example, and if you couldn't tell, I'm very big fan of maids, Neko maid's role. But anyways, for very big scenes that you want to do where someone is turning into a maid, you may take on a role of the person who is in charge of the maid. So you may be, for some examples, you could be the head maid, you could be the head butler, you could be the owner of wherever this maid works, you could be the person who hired them and is telling them what to do. And the more fully you can engage yourself in being, I am this role as well, the more fully you can immerse them into their role, because they can play off of you. It's just like in improvisation, when you have multiple people working with one another, the more you give someone to work with, the more they can work with it. And so, for one great example, I'd say, and when I was back in college, I had acting as one of my minors, and I loved to just go into the scenes and be told how to do it differently, and to see it become real. We had one practice that I loved very much, and that was, there was a table set up in the middle, we'd all stand in a big circle around the edge of it, and we'd be told that it was at a scene. One day we did a library, and we were told one by one people would go in and sit down and act like they were at the library. And the first time people went in, they were goofing around, they were fun, they were playing, they were just having fun and pretending like, they were sitting down and trying to make a little bit of a show of it. And once everyone had gone, the teacher said, okay, now I want you to act as though you are in real life and going to the library. You're just going in to get a book, to read something. It's a normal day. And people went in and they were much more subtle, but they sat down and the interactions were much more real. Rather than just being playful and entertaining, they'd actually sit down and they'd just ask a question to someone else. They'd have a discussion, or they'd just ignore each other altogether. And it became so much more of a mental immersion. Because when you go in to goof around, you're just pre-thinking, what's the funniest thing I could say? What's the goofiest way that I could do this? And to relate this to transformation play, if you go in thinking, with a transformation play, how can I make this scene really hot to start? Or how do I really change this mentality and create this idea? It becomes more of a mental practice where you're preemptively trying to create things. And it's good to have those ideas as a base, like what are things you might do. But if during the scene you're trying to actively create new concepts or trying to work into it, it's less immersion and it's more interaction. And with the practice we had at the acting class, we realized the difference, especially when it comes down to being in a role or interacting with a role. It's when you try to go in and try to play the role and try to be it the best, quote unquote, the best you can, you end up putting all of these pieces in that over exemplify or simply become more than the role might be naturally. And so going in and just sitting down and being a part of it and just letting it flow out from what was agreed upon. Like I said, the scene in this was at the library. You're coming in. We all agreed upon that. We came in and we sat down and we just did what we would do at the library. There was no pressure. There was no growth. There was no need to do more than what was there. And in many ways, a scene can be far more enjoyable, especially if they want to transform into a maid, into a robot, a puppet, or a mannequin. Treating them as the role, being a part of that role yourself, being something that plays off of that role and that they can play off of themselves, creates a mentality where it doesn't need to be the hottest, the heaviest, the strongest. It doesn't need to be a very intense scene. It can just be a very casual discussion. It can be a very open understanding. And by doing that, you create an understanding that you naturally pick up on. Like I mentioned earlier, in many social cues, you pick up naturally as you grow. As you get older, you see what people do and you mimic it. Certain cultures and societies are different in certain aspects, but in your own, you pick it up and you begin to reflect on that. Over time, when you build rapport with someone that you've been with, friends, family that you've been with for months, you've known for years, there is sort of an unspoken communication that eventually builds up. And this can happen very naturally, especially in transformation play, to understand what the physical or psychological expectations are, and it builds out over time. It's something that even the people involved may not be fully aware that they are doing, but it becomes a natural sense of rhythm that you can build up together. And that's a very big part of the build-up and growth, but it's a very big part of the immersion and engaging the person, because you want to make sure that they are actually connected not only with the scene, but with the person doing it if you are involved in the scene. And even if you're a puppet master in the background, learning how to get into that immersion and that rhythm as this out of the scene character that's pulling the strings, learning what would make it more and less immersive and learning how to work with that is a very important part, both for the hypnotist or the dominant and the person being hypnotized or the submissive. Because as you begin to learn where they need their strings to be pulled, you learn how to become that role, and they learn how to be pulled along. And as the person being pulled, the more you give them to work with and to understand, the more that they can start to pull you in the directions you want to. This is both the yes and the no's, and letting them know so that they can work that in that direction.
I think we should talk about specific tips that we've learned, you from acting, me from improvised comedy, and both of us from tabletop roleplay in general. There are things in all of those that we've learned that we should give tips from. So, starting off, when designing a character for tabletop roleplay, when you start off, and some people like to do this anyway, they'll try to overthink things. They'll really build out a detailed background and have rigid ideas about how I act in this moment and how I would act in this moment, and they try to fill it out. Where, after some time, a lot of more experienced role players, when they've made a character, and some systems actually encourage less of a background to start off with, when creating a character, giving yourself a smaller background, a more simpler one, can be easier to digest. The core concept is important. And then what that allows is for the role player to then add details as is necessary into what they are like and the background, either themselves or whatever the mind decides to come up with. With hypnosis, you'll want to make sure that they have permission to do that if you're using this method, and it can be very helpful in general to give them permission to ad-lib, I guess. So actually keeping things simpler so that they can fill it in regards to the background of what they are. I mean, if you're a mannequin, it's pretty simple. But if you're a maid, then, how did you get there? Or are you just starting off? Or have you been one for a while? Those all create different bases for the person to build up on. And you don't need a lot of detail there. And with permission to fill it in, it can become more immersive that way.
That's very true.
Now, one of the things that can be very useful, and it comes up quite a bit in improv comedy, is you're given a goal, a place you want to reach by the end of the scene. And so when you're doing transformation play, rather than giving someone a completely blank canvas as to what's going on, also having something at the end, a goal, it can help them fill out a character in a way that gets them to that goal and gives them much more direction to it as well.
Right. I'd say, especially one thing I would suggest is understanding the flexibility. The leaving areas open, especially if there are pieces that you would want more specifically decided between yourself and the person you're exploring with, is definitely a good way to create an in-between point where you can connect. I know there have been people I've worked with who have come in with a fully detailed outlined story on what they want to do and how they want to do it, and it's not a bad thing.
Unless they need to check in on the script every so often.
Right. Well, and that's why the main thing I would say when it comes down to flexibility is there's 3 different areas of flexibility you can have. One is how it works and what happens. Flexibility in pretty much what you're expecting to become, who you're expecting to be, and how the scene may play out. That's the first sense of flexibility, which is being open to what will happen. It's the idea of coming in, and if I were to go off on the idea of pet play, becoming an animal, you could say there are some points that aren't flexible, such as I want to have fur, I want some physical point of what I'd look like, and I'd want the room to be sort of a playroom.
Tails are fun.
Tails are very fun. And especially with the room that you're exploring with, if the person wants to be a playroom, the details of how that playroom works can be different. The type of fur that you can use can be flexible. And being open-minded about the pieces, you can set up an outline as you want and being open to putting in more pieces. Now, if you have a very specific outline detailed as to how the room should be, how I should look, the next flexibility that you can have is how you describe it. Understanding that you have an idea in mind, but it may not fully connect to another person. That's where a lot of the issues have come up in the past with people I've known who try to do transformation play, and they say, we tried it was fun, but it didn't really feel like I was in the moment. It didn't feel like I was connected. Being open to explaining in different formats, finding some way to connect with them and be flexible in your own wording and your own ideas are a way that you can connect to others, or it is a way that you can connect to others. And then that mainly plays into the fact that you are coming up to someone. If you have a fully built idea, let's say you've built a whole house and now you're trying to help someone understand how the house works, it's going to take a while, but being flexible to showing them the different pieces at the rate they pick it up and the way that they understand it is a very important factor. And this goes from people who have fully built out understandings to people who may just have a general starting point of, I just want to be a cat.
Talking about building it up, I would say the debrief can be very useful. So if you started with something simple and then you play and then you end, and then in the debrief, after any aftercare that needs to be done, you then ask the subject questions. Like, what did it feel like? Were there specific things that you imagined? What were you wearing? What was your fur like? Did you hear things differently? See things in another way? Finding out those things, enforcing those things as part of the suggestion in a future scene or during hypnosis can be very useful for building it up, using the information you can get from a debriefing.
Right. It's a learning experience for both sides. And when you are coming out of one scene, taking away what are things that worked. And I think one question that I've really learned, because we were offering tips, one big tip I would always ask is, did you feel like or encounter anything during the scene that made it more difficult to be immersed, to be the role you wanted to be? Was there anything that you learned that you would rather do differently? And the reason I would say it in that sense, and asking was there anything that made it feel more difficult, it's a lot of people will ask, was there anything wrong? Did it feel like you wanted to do anything better? And asking someone if there's anything you could do better creates an idea of, was there anything I didn't do good enough? And some people who are into the scenes and very much exploring may try to suppress some of their answers because they don't want to upset the hypnotist or cause issues. And if you ask, is something wrong? Like, was there something wrong with the scene? It comes down to feeling like it's a negative placement. So asking someone, was there something that you found difficult or something that you felt would have been easier to be in the role if it had been done differently, gives them the open ability to not give criticism, but instead to give feedback. The idea of saying, this was done very well, but this might have made it feel even better. And that way you build together. You feed each other information, you grow from it. And this sort of feeds into, I believe, the third form of flexibility. The first one being flexible with what you can do in the scene and how it's done. The second one is with your explanation and the outline of how the person may look at it. The third form of flexibility is, I guess, in a very simple way to put it, the third form of flexibility is flexing from one scenario to another. This can be from starting and finishing one, or simply from the idea of considering what's another scenario that's similar to it. For example, being a butler and a maid, very similar roles, very similar ideas, it may be difficult to compare one to the other and be flexible in each of those mentalities, but it lets you, as the person who's being the hypnotist, the person who's being hypnotized, you each can take on a role that would be similar and come to understand each other. So being flexible in your understanding of where they may be and what they may do, it's very similar to the second form of flexibility of explaining the scenario, but it's putting yourself in their shoes, which I think is a very big aspect we've discussed quite often here. And that's how you become immersed, is getting into the other person's head, into their shoes, and seeing what they're experiencing. And so the third form of flexibility would be, how do you compare this scene to other things you've already experienced? Being flexible enough to allow other forms of understanding to connect it and make it more natural. That way you can build out this idea based upon things you already know, or things that they may more fully be able to understand, and then build back to it. Like I had mentioned in past podcasts, the idea that you're each walking on separate paths that may be near each other, but figuring out the pieces that are similar in and outside of the scene to make those paths more similar to understand each other is how you build out that underlying rapport, that subtle understanding that may not be a conscious effort, but may instead be an automatic building of reasoning and understanding that helps to align what you're aiming for. And especially when it comes down to doing transformation play, being a kitty and an owner can be far more interactive, far more immersive than just having a kitty running around in a room and playing with toys and doing things. That may be what someone's looking for, and not turning that down, as that may be very immersive, but having more that they can work with and play with is very important. And I'd say that's a big tip that I've learned from acting is the more you let your mind and your being connect with a scene, the better. It's the difference between walking into a bedroom and seeing the normal bedroom that you would be in. And one scene we did in acting was you'd go into a framework bedroom, literally just an outline, a couple of beds, a chair, and a door. And walking in and we would get into a fight was the story. 2 roommates getting into a fight. And when we first did it, we just got into this argument. We just played off each other. We just saw each other and we were just like, we're in a bedroom, we're here, and we're getting into a fight. And that's all that we really saw. And then we were taught, be aware of the fact that you two live there. This tension has been there. And the room, it's a small room. You've been in each other's faces and have not addressed this for a long time. Even before you got to the room, you were angry. Rather than just being in each other's faces, you build in that sense of what is happening, and you play off of more than just what is in the current scene. So what might have happened before, what's been happening during it, and what is the environment that you're playing off of. Being in a much smaller room can be far more intimate and far more reactive than being in a very large open room. And even the idea of what are factors that would really play to increase the immersion. And I think we've already gone on what are things that would decrease the immersion, but it's the idea of how much does your mind actually connect. So many of these social cues we pick up on are trained or learned naturally, so we don't have to analyze them and pick up on them and create them. So if you want to have a scene where someone is angry, you can incorporate so many things. You can have a light that doesn't work well. You can have a fan that makes noise. You can discuss having had an angry discussion even before you got there. You can have different points or different ideas that you would have built on over time that would become this angry argument. I mean, when you're in a relationship and you have a fight, it's not usually because of just one little factor. It's because there's been something of a buildup. Some people may fight over everything, but there's usually a buildup of understanding. And when it comes to positive, so say being happy or joyous, there's usually an outline as well for what happened before, what led up to this. Was there a negative that led to a positive? Were they very upset and then became very happy? And doing these pieces that make it feel less like you're just snapping your fingers and the scene starts. And the room you're in transforms from, let's say it's a hotel room, into a playground for people to run around and just goof around and do whatever they want. Let's say they want to be a dog running around in a pet park. The more you can make the transition, and this is why it's called transformation play, because I think that's one thing that we can really address is the idea of it transforming, taking from one state. And the more aspects truly transform, the more immersive it is. If you see someone transform physically from one body into another, it's very immersive. If you transform a room from a cold, dark place into a warm, sunny place, the transformation is very large in contrast. But showing all the steps that get there is how the transformation becomes far more immersive.
And changing the way the subject sees the scene partner can help that using suggestion during the trance. So, stay safe, have fun, and I hope that this has been useful.
Yep, take care and be well.
Bye. Just a quick editor's note. Myself and Dracoso wanted to talk about gender transformation, but as we're both cis male, we stumbled over the topic and felt it would be better to re-record the section with a guest on the non-binary scale themselves. So if we can put that together, I hope to get it to you as soon as possible as a bonus episode between our normal ones. Thank you so much for joining us for today's topic.
If you've enjoyed this, you can support us at patreon.com/braincage. You can also join us over on Discord at Fetlandia and talk with us directly.
Links for both are listed in the description.
Thanks again for listening, and take care.
I've had too much caffeine. I'm going to stop recording. I've had too much